All right, so now we're going to get started on our next project, which is going to be an environment, cinema 4D environment. And this is going to be a stylized, not stylized, and it's going to be low polygons. So something along this line is what we're going to be going after, okay? So nothing incredibly complex. Again, we'll be looking at different ways to create different shapes, just to make the process a lot simpler. You can get really complex with it, shapes like this. These are still very basic shapes, but they've just kind of organized it a bit better, or have a lot more detail to them. Even things like this is really nice because it's really quick to add these kinds of shapes to our environment, stuff like that. So you may want to pop into YouTube and just start browsing stuff once we get started on this. The way we're going to do this assignment is I'm going to go through the basic setup process, the basic workflow, and then you'll be able to design your own, okay? So it's not going to be everyone's creating the exact same things. You may have 50 trees in yours and I have 3 trees. You may have a fire hydrant where I don't have a fire hydrant, okay?
So you're going to be giving us a setup while we are trying to create our own?
Correct.
In a new scene?
Yep. Yep. So you'll be able to really play with this one compared to like the last one, which was very kind of like, we're making a desk, we're making a chair, we're making a bookcase, now go and do the rest of it. Okay. So, first things first. We have to go to our P drive and we have to duplicate our folder, right? So we have our template project. We need to control drag our template project so we get a copy of it, and then rename it Stylized Environment.
I've also did that on my flash drives before.
Okay. All right. So we have our folder set up. When we come into Cinema, we want to hit Edit Preferences, right? Control E. Go to that Files area and tell Cinema where our project folder is. I have 2 paths because I still have my old one. You don't need to have the other one because your other one was already clear. We're not working on that one anymore. You only need to load in the most recent one. Mine's already there, so I'm just going to leave it. I could just hit delete and delete it, but that would take too much effort. Cool, we'll close that. Under display, go to the Gorad shading lines, or you can hit NB, right? And then what was the other one? We go under cameras, navigation, object mode. Okay, so those are the 3 things typically every single time you come into Cinema that you'd want to do. All right, so our first thing we need to do is we need to create some sort of land to kind of base all of our stuff off of. In some cases, it's very geometric, polygon, shape like this. You could go crazy with this, but we're going to keep it pretty simple to start off. Okay, so the idea is that we're going to have a little bit of a cityscape area here. You can have a city with like a hill in the background or something if you want to, but let's just start off with the same base and then work on some similar stuff, and then you can explore after. Okay, so we're going to start off with a cube. And this is going to be our street, okay? So imagine that we have a curbed area, and we basically want to have a curb which is kind of rounded along the edges, right? And kind of rounded on the tops. That's what we want to create. So I'm going to create a very squarish kind of shape here. And it's kind of like flattish, like that. All right, and then I'm just going to put some,
You want this to be
how big?
big.
It doesn't matter, just relatively big. And anytime we're building anything, the size isn't going to matter so much as proportions, right? So in this case, we just want it a square that's kind of flat. Okay, so then I'm going to add a bevel to this. Now eventually what I want to do is I want to create more of like a rounded shape, like the corners are going to be rounded a bit. So just if you want to see what mine's going to look like and then you can see how I'm creating it, I'm going to each one of these corners and I'm just going to add a little bevel to it. Okay, so I grabbed each edge in the corner. And then I added a little bevel like that with 3 subdivisions.
How do you add the bevel again?
Remember, we have to grab the edge, then we hit MS, and then you just click and drag right on those edges.
How did you select the word?
Did you hit C yet? There you go.
Yeah, I was there as well. I kind of forgot as well until I remembered.
Right, so we have this kind of rounded off shape.
I have a question.
Mhm.
More of like a polygon thing. Oh, is that because you added?
Yours went like this, right?
Yeah.
Yep, so just add a couple subdivisions. Now the number here isn't incredibly important because I know that what I'm going to eventually do is I'm going to add a smooth to this, and that smooth will smooth it out even more. Okay, so definitely not 0 because that'll be like too smooth. 3 is a good number because it still maintains that curvature. 3 subdivisions. All right, so now we're going to add a, I'll show you why we're going to do this first, okay? So what I want to do is smooth this whole thing out. I want this edge to be nice and smooth. I could add a bevel right here. That's an option, grabbing this entire loop all the way around and then beveling that. I'm not going to do this, but I just want you to see. I could do that, and that will create a nice little cap there. No, we're not doing that. If I go, because that is too many selections. If I smooth this out, it turns into this, which that doesn't look good at all.
Yeah, that.
Right?
Unless somebody was doing like a mosaic for a church or something.
Right. I don't think we're doing that.
That's
So if I go to my loop tool and I just put a loop, let's say here and there, and then I do that, I get a better result. Okay, now it still looks like it's doing something funky, but once I turn off those lines, you'll see that we just get a nice little edge.
So hit the loop tool and add.
Yep, just add one loop here and one loop there. Yes, sir.
I think I messed up.
Why'd you do that? Okay, now if we smooth this out, you'll see that we don't get an actually smooth result. Like, it should be rounding this off, and it's not rounding it off. That's awfully peculiar. It definitely should be rounding it off. I believe. Uh-huh. Yes, sir. Yep. You can see that again. We extrude inner. We extrude inner again. With the cube selected, we hold Alt and add that subdivision. Yes, sir.
What number is your subdivision renderer at?
Mine is at 2 and 3. I didn't change those yet.
Okay, I just didn't know that was a 3 or a 5 from this angle.
Yeah. The projector's not very detailed. All right, so this is okay. I would really like to have a bit more roundness here, especially having it more like a curb. Right now it just looks like a sharp edge, okay? So what we can do is whenever we do a subdivision surface, because of how it structures it, we can turn that subdivision surface off. So that's what this check mark is for. So click that check mark off, and then you'll see that we go back to the original shape that we had before we did the subdivision, right? So what we want to do is we're going to delete this edge going around the top. Okay? By deleting that edge, it won't be so tight at the top. It'll be a little bit more looser, and we can create a nice little rounding. So we're going to go to the edge, make sure we're in the Move tool, and then just double-click it, just like we did before. And what we don't want to do is hit just the Delete key, because it will do that. Okay? We want to right-click and then say Dissolve. Yes, sir. Okay, so now if we check the subdivision surface back on, you'll see we get something that looks more like a curb. It looks like it's more like rounded up into it versus what we had, a second ago, which was maybe a little bit too square off. Now we could, depending on how close those edges are, we could change the shape of that. So we're going to leave it as is, but just something that you may want to jot down to play with later. That instead of us going through and deleting that edge, if I pulled it down to, let's say, here and made a new one, it would crisp that edge up a bit more. And even with the subdivision surface checked, I can still go back to the cube, double-click that edge, and I can still move it and change the shape of that. Okay? You just have to be very careful because I can't see what's actually happening to the cube. If I uncheck this, let's say I pull it right to, let's say I pull it above it, right? We talked before about not crossing edges. When I smooth it, it doesn't look like it got crossed. It looks like it's fine. But at some point, it'll actually have like a little lip around it like this that I would be able to see. Okay? So you have to be careful with that. Typically, for beginners especially, I tell them to turn the subdivision off, move the line so you can see they're not crossing it, and then turn it back on. Okay? So something you can play with later is if you want to add another edge there, you could definitely do that. All right, so now let's add a building. So this is basically our city block. All right? And we want to add multiple buildings into this area. So what we don't want to do is create one building that's this big, because then there's only like 4 buildings that can fit in this whole block. Okay? So we're going to create a cube, and we're going to size it down to an appropriate size so that we can fit enough buildings on this block. Okay? And what I also want to do is I want to make sure that this is, let me shrink this down quite substantially here. I want to make sure that this is a square building. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get about where I'm at, and then my size X and my size Z need to be the same.
Is there something that should be underneath my city block?
No. You want to rest right on top of the ground. So right on top of that block area. Do you have a question, Cameron?
How big do you want it to be, sir?
Just, again, looking at the size of this building that I have here, I can probably fit a good number of buildings in at this size. Okay? So just eyeball it. Mine's 45. Yours might be 150, depending on how big your city block is.
You want us to scale it down?
I just want it to be about this size. Okay? And then we have to make sure that our size X matches our size Z. Now, the way that we're doing this, at any point you can come back in and tweak the shape of this. So if you decide you want a bigger building, that's fine. You can duplicate the building or scale the building up and tweak some of the parameters to get everything to match what you want. So just wherever it's at, just make sure size X and size Z are the same, and then size Y will just be that. It's fine. Okay. Size Y is just whatever it is. Whatever Y ended up being, that's just the height of my building. That's going to be not going to matter for what we're going to be doing to create the windows and doors and stuff. Okay.
I think I did a pretty good job of my build.
All right, so now what we want to do is give the building a little bit of personality to it. So I'm going to hit C so that I can edit it. And I'm just going to add, you know how some of the buildings, if you look at, especially if you look for an aerial shot. Let's say New York. The top of the buildings have a lot of detail to them, like things like this, things like that. You know, there's a lot of stuff that you can add to make this look pretty nice. So we're going to add basically just like a little inset at the top of this. So I'm going to grab the top face, and I'm just going to do an extrude inner to pull it in slightly, and then a regular extrude to push it down. Okay, so just an extrude inner, and then a regular extrude just to push it down.
And the regular extrude key is M1?
What is the regular extrude key?
MD.
Just D.
Oh.
No, MW and then
MWD?
MW is extrude inner.
Yeah.
That brings it in. And then you hit D, and then you can push it down.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So there's that. We should add probably a front door to this because you have to get into the building somehow. So how would we add a division? If we want to add a division right here, what tool would I use or key would I use?
line cut.
Edges?
Loop cut.
Oh.
Yep. So this will be however tall our building is going to, or however high our entrance is going to be. So again, looking at the scale of the building, this building could be 7,000 feet tall or it could be 60 feet tall, right? It doesn't matter. It's just a matter of when we set this value here, that's going to be setting the scale of our building. Okay? So visually, people will be able to say, okay, that's about how big a person would be that would be able to fit through the door. Okay, so just put in a arbitrary height line. Again, you can move it later. You can tweak these things later. Just kind of get it closer to the bottom than the top. And then I'm going to drop in a couple vertical lines, and that will be basically like the door opening.
How do you get the vertical lines?
You have to click on the bottom edge, because when you click on this edge, it thinks you're trying to move that edge. So I would click this way to add the height, and then I would go to the bottom, and then I go boom, and boom.
You did that by just pressing L.
K and then L, right? That's a knife loop. Yeah, and you can also right-click too and just go right to loop path cut. So if you ever get lost, like I don't know which ones to hit, just go right there. All right, and then once you have those faces in there, then you can extrude that face in. All right, so now we just have an opening here. We can come back later. We can add an actual like door to this. A door in this case is just going to be a cube. We would literally just drop a cube in there, and then we could shape it however we want. So just watch how I would create a door, and then you can just kind of see how that kind of process would work. Okay. So the first thing I would do is just kind of shape this out into a rough structure. if it gets confusing having all these objects on top of each other, there is a solo button right here. And I could say viewport solo single, and it would solo that one item. Okay? So rough proportions of the door, let's say it's that.
We're making another.
Nope, you're watching. You're watching and then just seeing how I'm going to create a door. We're not going to create a door together. We're going to create a window system together, and then you can see how that's created based off of the door, and then go from there. Building door. Again, look at reference. Reference is like your biggest help, okay? Because this is a low polygon model, we don't want to go crazy with the amount of detail. We want to add a sufficient amount of detail to make it look like it has detail, but nothing insane. Like I wouldn't go through and build every single one of these planes because that might be a bit too much. Or especially like that, that's like way too much, okay? So something that just gives us the essence of what the door is. I think that one's kind of cool because it has a glass and then it has these lines here, so that's the one I'm going to build, okay? So remembering back to our last assignment where we basically made a cabinet, right? I can take this whole thing. I'm going to delete the faces on it. There we go. Nope, I just did a solo so it hit everything else. So I'm going to add a division here, and that's this line. I'm going to add a division there for that bar, add another division for that bar. And of course I can customize this. It doesn't have to be exactly like theirs. I think it would probably still have 3 though, so I'll have to move that around a little bit. I think put that one there and this one here. Okay. And then this will be the kick plate in the bottom. And then there will be a sidebar here and a sidebar there. Okay, so this is just me adding the divisions for where I want to be able to move stuff around to. Okay, very similar to what we did before on that other one. On the bookcase, on the desk. All right, that's cool. Now I'm going to go to my faces. I'm just going to extrude the whole thing. Can I extrude the whole thing? No, I'm just going to grab the border and extrude. We don't need the whole thing right here. Do this. Okay, I'm grabbing the glass parts, and there's actually an invert, so I'm going to invert it. That makes it easier. Then I can just extrude this out. And then that looks like that door, right? Similar enough to the door. And then it has a little handle on there, so I could also create a handle. Oops. All right, now here's how easy a handle is to build. I just take these 3 faces here, that's all I have. And I'm just going to take these. I'm going to extrude. Hey. So now I've extruded that just to give me some thickness. Now, if we look at this as I extrude this in, it's doing the same thing either way. It's not filling in this gap here, which I want that to fill in. Yes, sir. What do you mean? I'm showing how to make a door.
Okay, is it the same one we extruded?
Nope, just watch. All right, so I want to fill that in. So I could use the bridge tool. Remember the bridge we use for faces? I could use that for edges too. But it comes with this option right here, create caps. And that will automatically cap that off. Okay, so that just makes our process of creating a door handle pretty easy to do. And then if I take that and I added a subdivision to it, that looks pretty horrible. Let me go here. And because this is, again, low poly, we may not need to add a whole subdivision. I may be able to just go through and just add a little bevel and add some less divisions there. I think that might look good. Okay. Now for this project, at no point are we going to be this close to the door. So the reason we don't want to have a lot of detail also is because we're going to be so far away from it. If we have too much detail, it's hard to see, it gets kind of muddy. But like something like that, I think that would work pretty good. Okay? So, like I said, we're not making the door together. That's how I would make a door.
Oh.
Okay? You missed everything. All right, so now I'm going to unsolo that. So I'm going to unsolo this. This is obviously way too big, so I'm going to group it. Put it back where it was. I'm going to group it. I'm going to scale. And then I'm going to put it in position. Now what I don't want to do is scale this up ununiformly, right? So I don't want to grab this and do that because that stretches everything out and it looks kind of weird. What I want to do is I want to grab just this top part and pull that up and the bottom part and pull that down. So if I switch to points, and you'll see that because I'm selected on the group, there's no points there, so I have to grab these items. Then I can grab this and pull it down. Okay, so I'm just in my marquee selection, grabbed all the points, pulled them down. The handle may now be too low, so I'll just grab the handle points and pull those up a little bit. I think that'll work. And then I can just grab my group and just kind of push it into there. And if it needs to be a little bit wider, I'll go back to the points and scoot that over and then grab these and then scoot that over. Sweet. So there's our door, okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to create a window in a similar fashion. Again, keeping it low resolution, and then also focusing on just the major details of it, okay? So again, we go to Google, we type in building window.
I'm guessing we're just want to use for now.
Nope, this one we're going to build together,
Okay.
okay? So again, looking at details of windows and how we want to set up things, you can have, if you looked at some buildings in like New York or Chicago or some of the older buildings, typically they would have, not every building, they would have like square windows like this, and then usually like maybe the top set of windows would be like arced like that. That's a common thing you'll see, okay? Or all of them will be arced or whatever. Also, all these buildings will have inset windows. Ours are not going to be inset. Ours are going to be outset, but they'll look inset just because of how we build them. We'll have like a frame around it, okay? So something like, let's say something like that is what we're going to build, okay? So we're going to build one of these windows here. So we're going to start off with a cube. Most of your items will start off with a cube. And then just shape and size this to about where you want the window to be. It doesn't matter where on the building, just kind of like a random spot on the building. We'll be moving and adjusting it after. You're just getting it, how big is the window? And where would it be located on the building? The location really is just kind of like an eyeball of, you know, where we want it. Are you in your model mode? Remember that the points, the little dots don't show up unless we're back in that modeling mode. And then we can see the points. Right there.
I am in modeling mode, it's not letting me do that.
And you're selected on your move tool?
Yes.
All right, so I have roughly a spot for my window. Now this is a huge window just so you can see. It's actually probably like almost as big as my doors, right? But again, I can come back and I can tweak any of those settings afterward. All right, so I want this window to be, you know, like one of these windows here. So the first thing I want to do is hit C so I can edit it. I'm going to go to my face here. I'm going to do an extrude inner just like we did on the top. Bless you.
Extrude inner, that's MW.
MW, yep. Yep, I think that's good there. And then I'm just going to do a regular extrude and just push it in. All right, now remember when I did the door handle, I use this create caps button. Okay, whenever you use create caps, or whenever you do anything inside Cinema, it remembers those settings. So right now I'm extruding, I don't see anything happening to my window. It's because the create caps is on, it's actually putting a cover on top of that. So I have to make sure that I uncheck it so I can see what's happening inside there. Okay, yours shouldn't have that because you didn't do the create caps. Okay, so there's our basic window shape. If I want to create a little window sill, I could extrude down here and then grab that face and extrude that out. And that'll give me a little window sill. What else could I do? I could add, you know, again, we can go in with lots of detail in here if we wanted to. Oops. I could do another little extrusion there just to give myself basically just a little border, just to kind of break up the surface a little bit more. It's still low resolution, it's still nothing crazy, but it just breaks it up a bit more. Okay, so again, yours isn't going to have to look like mine, but I want you to be able to play with the modeling tools a little bit just to see what you can create with some very, very basic shapes. All right, that'll be good enough for now, okay? You can always come back and tweak the shape. So now what I want to do is I want to duplicate the shape so that I have this covering my entire building, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to build one face, okay? So one side of our building will be covered with windows, and then we'll duplicate that and move it over to the other three sides, right? So here's what we don't want to do. We don't want to hold down Control and drag, and then drag, and then drag, because this would take forever, and obviously this wouldn't be exact. You can see the spacing here is not exact. If we have any kind of decent architecture person building this structure, then everything would be precise. Okay, so under this MoGraph area, there's a thing called a cloner, and what it does is it'll actually take our shape and it'll clone it wherever we want it to be cloned, okay? Now the way it works is very similar to the subdivision surface. The cloner has to be the parent, and then the cube has to be the child of it. So if we hold down Alt with the cube selected, hold down Alt and then go to MoGraph Cloner, it will put it into a cloner. Okay, and then you'll see cloner and then cube 1, which we should probably rename window. And we should probably rename our building.
Yeah, I've already been doing that.
Yes, very good. Okay. So on our cloner, the default settings for it are to clone vertically. So you can see we have 3 different windows, and they're cloned vertically. Each one is offset by 50 centimeters. Okay? So right here it says 50 centimeters is how much it's being offset. Here's how many clones we have. If I hit the up arrow here on the count, you'll see that we'll just get more and more and more. Okay? Now this, just so you can see the power of this, we could do a honeycomb array. Where did you go? You're probably inside. No, you're not. Oh, there it is. It's just bigger. Let me add a lot more here. Not more, and I'll take this down to like 5. And there you go. So we can have this many windows duplicated automatically. So something, you know, it would take us forever to have to do that manually, we could do that. Yes, sir. Oh was not a question. What was that?
Oh, have you thought about a good distance for the windows?
Not yet. One thing at a time. All right, so you could also do it to an object. So I could actually take this item and duplicate it around an object. There's a lot of power within this cloner object. So what we want to do is we want to set this up so that we have basically a grid of windows right here that we could then clone again and populate to the other sides of the building. So I'm going to go to the mode and change this to a grid array. All right. Now, by default, the grid array is a 3D grid, meaning that it's not just X and Y, but it's also Z. So we have some depth in there. So looking at where I put my first window, this is in the X direction. Okay, you can see this direction here. So I don't want to have any clones going this way. I only want them to go this way and this way. So Z and Y. So down here, this is X, Y, and Z. So in the X direction, I only want 1. So I'm just going to put 1. For the size of X, I'll just put 0 because I don't need anything there. And then for the rest of this, the only thing we need to play with is the sizing, which is basically how far do you want this grid to be, like how big this direction and then how big that direction, and then how many clones do you want between them. So right now it's set to 200 and 200. If I move my one window to the middle of this, you can see how we have these dots on the far windows. I can just drag those in. And then the same thing at the top, I can just drag that in. If I move this window to the middle, that's too many windows. And then just changing the count will populate that entire side. Okay, so you can move the dots to figure out where the width of it is, where the height of it is. Use the arrow to move the position. And then just use the count here and the count there to control how many windows you have. Now obviously you could do it like this. That's more of an office building, I would think. This is more of like an apartment building. And then what's awesome about this is that if we decided, I don't like how this is turning out, I don't like all these windows, the look of these windows, we can uncheck the cloner, go back to our default shape, make this whatever we want, and it'll automatically populate to all those other spots. Yes, sir?
How did you get it like that? How did you make those many?
You have your cloner, right?
Yeah, I have my cloner.
Okay. Did you resize it so it fits the building? Right, grabbing the dots and pulling it in.
Well,
If at some point we accidentally hit C, that cloner gets baked in. We don't want to do that, okay? So typically on your cloners, especially for this assignment, don't hit C on it. Leave it the way it is, okay? Keep the cloner there. If I do, just so you can see, if I hit C, all of these windows are now baked in. So I can't go back in there and change the positioning or the count of them without undoing a lot of stuff. So do not hit C on the cloner. Now let's say that I wanted to change something on that window. I didn't like how, let's say I wanted a bar crossing it, right? Just like we saw in the picture, a bar going across. So I'm going to add a bar.
want us to try this out?
No, you don't have to add this. You can add this kind of stuff later. I want you to see how we would add stuff. All right, that bar is way too big still. Okay, again, 15 different ways to make a bar. This is how I'm doing this one. All right, so there's the bar there. And then I'm going to duplicate it, so I'll hold Control and drag it, rotate it. There it is. Okay. So now I have these two bars here. Come on. Pull them out a little bit more. Let me just preview what that looks like. Yep, that's good. Okay. All right, so now what I want to do is I want to add those bars into this. Just because I put them here, that means nothing to Cinema. When I turn my cloner back on, you'll see that none of these have those bars. So then what would you think we need to do to get these things to clone?
Put them in the cloner category?
Yep, so if we just drag these into the cloner, we have to do two things. Drag it into the cloner, you'll see that it does this.
Oh. Well, that's weird.
Right. So what it's doing is, because we have multiple objects in the cloner, it's like cycling through each one. So it's cloning cube 1, then cube, then window. So to get around that, I grab all three and I group them. And now Cinema knows that's a group. So now anything I drop into that group will automatically duplicate all over the place. Okay? So just remember that when you do yours. All right, so now we want to take this cloner and we want to duplicate it to the other sides of the buildings. Okay? So this was a grid array that allows us to do exactly this, you know, a grid of windows on this side here. But what we want to do now is we want to do what's called a radial cloner, which will duplicate it in a circular fashion. If you have a circle with only 4 points in it, what is it? Yeah, it's a square, right? Which is what our building would be. So we're going to take the cloner and we're going to put a cloner on top of the cloner. Okay, so you hold Alt, you go to MoGraph, and you go to cloner. Okay, it will do that again, like there's windows on top of windows. It may look confusing, just ignore it for 2 seconds. Okay, as long as we have our cloner here, a cloner there, and then the null, or whatever your window, you should be good. Under the mode for the toppest cloner, we're going to change that to radial. Okay, now this is how mine turned out. Yours might turn out a little bit different. It doesn't matter. Eventually, they're going to end up in the same spot. Okay, it doesn't know which direction we want to radially clone this. It doesn't know that these are windows and this is a building, so we have to tell it that. Yes, sir.
It kind of looks like a logo for a company.
Right, or a windmill.
Or a windmill.
So down here where it says count, we're going to set that to 4, because that's how many sides we have. And then under the plane area, we're going to change this to try a different one, okay? Especially at first, the XYZ thing is going to throw you, like, I don't know which way to go. It's X and Z is the one, for me, is the one that's going to work. That should be the one for you that also works.
Oh, yeah, it works.
Okay?
Although it looks like a satellite.
Yes, it does. All right, let's see, where else do we need to change? Not that. Oh, right. So now what I need to do is I need to get this so that they are fixed or rotated the correct direction. So our cloner basically took our windows. Here's my example. So our windows were perfectly like this. When we cloned it, it popped it this direction. It thinks this is the front direction. So what we have to do is we have to go back to the first cloner, and we have to rotate the first cloner 90 degrees. Okay? So I go back to the first cloner, I go to my rotate tool, and I rotate it 90 degrees. Why aren't you updating? Oh, sorry, nope, never mind, hold on. Yep, that's the wrong spot. All right, sorry, different process. On the second cloner, we're going to go to the Transform tab, and this is where we're going to do our rotate here. Okay, so you're going to go to your H and set that to 90.
Where's transform?
On this cloner, your second cloner, there's one of the tabs is called transform.
Okay. And then what do we do?
You set that to 90 in the H. And that should rotate it all the way around. If it doesn't, then put it back to 0 and try a different direction, or try negative 90. Okay? Now you'll see that we still don't have this lined up exactly where we want this to be. So if we go back to object now, we have to do two things. One, reset the radius to 0. Well, maybe not 0. Yep, not 0, sorry. I think it wants to be half of our building. So my building, I believe, was 45. Yeah. So we're going to go to the radius and make it it's roughly half the size of your building originally was. You can just eyeball it. So if you just keep clicking the arrow here, eventually you'll get to the spot where it lines up pretty good. Okay, so I think mine's actually going to be like 23 is where it wants to be. Yep, 23 looks like a good value. And then I'm just moving this whole block until it fits my building. Okay, so that process again, let me undo so you can see it again. All right, we got our original cloner. We changed it from linear to radial. We set the count to 4. We changed the plane. We went to transform and rotate it 90 degrees. And then we pulled it here. And then to get this thing to center correctly, we just had to go to the radius and just lower the radius until all the windows were on the outside and look nice. So mine happened to be 23. Yours is probably going to be a different number because we did not model these the exact same way. All right, now if you're having trouble ever doing this, looking at it in the top view, this red line right here, if I move this, that should line up right with the center of my world, right there. And then the blue line should line up right there. So this should be lined up perfectly with the red and blue this way. And then this is even like an easy way to kind of line this up. So if I went to 22.75, that's probably exactly where I want to be. Nice and snug. Now again, at any point we can come back to our first cloner and I can still change the count of windows, and you can see how it updates all of my windows. So any of those settings I can always go back and I can tweak what I'm doing there. Okay? So now what we want to do is just add some basic coloring to all of our objects. So on yours, we really only have the window, right?
Yeah.
So we're going to disable both cloners. Yep, and then find your window. Now it's probably going to be inside of the building. So then what we're going to do is we're going to have to go to that solo and say this S over here and say viewport solo single. Okay, make sure you have the window clicked, and then you hit viewport solo single. You have your window selected. All right. Now for this, we are not going to use anything crazy material-wise. We're going to keep everything pretty simple. If you look at the coloring on some of those stylized environments, you'll see that this one has some coloration. There's some shades of different greens on it. Something like this has some different shades, but a lot of that is just solid color coming across. So that's what we're going to be doing. You could add some noise patterns or some detail to them later, but for now, again, we'll just keep it simple. So I'm going to double click down here to make a new material. This will be called Window 01. Inside our building or inside our environment, we may have 6 or 7 different window textures we may want to use. One building may have bright blue, one might have less bright blue, one might have like a yellowish tint, one might have blackened windows, whatever, right? So we want to make sure we have an idea of what it's doing. So for the window, we want some shine to them, and we want some color. Those are only 2 things we want, okay? So I'm going to go to my blue. I'm going to pick a nice blue for my windows. Like that. The important thing at this point is just to get a rough coloring in there. We can always come back and play with the coloring later, right? Especially after we start duplicating stuff, we want to make sure that we have, plenty of details. Under the reflectance, we'll set that to Beckman, and we'll take the reflection strength up and the roughness down.
Wait, what?
Under reflectance,
Yeah.
we'll change the type to Beckman, and let's see how much we want on here. Don't want to be too rough, like that. So I'm doing about 15 and 15% roughness, 15% reflection. Okay, that way I'll have some reflection inside my scene, and it'll be kind of dispersed. It's not going to be like a sharp reflection. Again, we can always come back and tweak any of these settings. So don't be like freaked out about I need it to be more reflective or whatever. Okay, so there's the window. And then I'm going to double click again, and I'll make another one for the window frame. And then again, a window frame 01, because I may have 17 different window frames that I end up wanting to use. Now for this one, we're not going to go with a straight color. Okay, we're going to be rendering this a special way where I don't want to have any kind of shading on this one like this. So I'm going to turn off my reflectance and turn off my color, and I'm going to use luminance. And luminance, we're basically just picking a solid color. Okay, so for this, that's going to be the color of my window frame. Good enough. Okay, now what luminance does is basically ignores any lighting information and just gives us straight color. So it doesn't matter if we have 1,000 lights in the scene. Well, if we have 1,000 lights, it might make a difference. If we have one bright light, it might make a difference. But for the most part, it's just going to be that color. Okay, so there's no shading to it. So on the window itself, which is here, that gets the blue. And then on the everything else, that will get the window frame. You mean to get just the window here?
Yeah, because I'm doing that and getting all my windows from the cloner.
Make sure your cloners are disabled.
Oh.
Good. Sir. All right, so once we have this, then we can turn our cloners back on, and then turn our solo off. And then that's what we should end up with, right? Mm-hmm. So this is our building. There's our windows. Now you can go back and you can tweak and modify like crazy, okay? Now what we want to do is we're going to take our building, okay? So I have, in mind, I have a doorway, so I'm going to just put the doorway there. You don't have that yet, okay? So before you do these next steps, obviously you'd want to make your door, and then make any other changes you might want to add on top of this.
So right now, just watch.
Yep, you're just watching right now, okay? So,
The others until after you get the door.
correct. Yeah, because you want to get the door and any other changes, right? So your first one, we did the window together, kind of rushed. You may want to add more detail to it. I still would want to texture these little bars too, okay? Once I have all of my first building completed, I want to say, cool, I'm happy with the way this one turned out, and then I want to group it all. And then what I can do is then duplicate this throughout the scene. So now I could just hold down the control key and drag it over here, and then change it. So if I just open this up, go to my building, I could grab all the points for the top. And now this will, let's say, be a shorter building. So let's say about there looks like a good size, like that. Now because I have my second building, all I have to do is go to my first cloner. That controls how many windows are going up and how many windows are going out. And I just change the amount going up. So I go, let's say 3, and then I just pull this down, and then pull that, oops. Oops, sorry, pulled the second one, there it is, the second one down. And now my second building is pretty much done. If I want to change the kind of windows, I would just go into the window area here and change what those windows look like. Maybe on these ones, I don't have the bars. So because I just unchecked the bars here, they don't render. So now I just have no bars there, bars here. And then I could take this whole setup again, and I could hold Control and duplicate it again. And then do changes to this one. So maybe over here I have rounded windows, and then I duplicate it again. And then I would have a different size building, different size windows, and whatever. Okay? So it's something that you could do very easily. Now the other thing that you can do is once you even have this whole setup here, you could even put that into a cloner. And make this a grid. I'm going to go none or 1 in the Y direction. Holy cow. Let's say okay. The more clones I have, because there's so much geometry now, the slower this is going to take. Okay, so you can see how slow this station is going. And so now I'm basically using that same building all over the entire city area. And if I decided to, or if I added more other buildings in here, this is like way too many of this one specific building. Maybe I would only do like, let's say 3 here and 2 there. There we go. So something like that. Now I could sprinkle in some other buildings into the mix, and then I would get a whole array of different buildings, right? Or what I could do, remember how I took my cloner and I added stuff inside there and it automatically like cycled through the list of objects that are being cloned? Well, I could do that with my other building. So this is my other building, right? Short building. I'll fix that you later. Tall building. All right, so if I drop this into here, you'll see that some of my buildings are short and some of my buildings are tall. So eventually what we should be able to do with this project is create 6 different buildings, drop them into one cloner, and it'll automatically populate it throughout the street area, okay? We could even have some where it makes them facing this way on some of them and this way on the other ones, right? Because obviously the doors wouldn't all face the same exact direction. That's kind of weird. But we can adjust that later, okay? So your job now is just to go through, finish up your one building. So fancy up the windows, add a door to it, add materials to the door, same kind of stuff there. And then once you have that, then you can duplicate that entire setup and then start making building number 2. By the end of this, you should have 6 buildings. Think about all the different detail you can add to the building simply by, let's see,
different building types?
Correct. That's not a building.
Yeah, that's, we were doing buildings, not rural areas.
Not random spots, yeah. Like this here too is good. Like all these little boxes that are on top of the buildings, all those little things are just little details. You don't have to add them to every building. Those are things you could also just create and then just populate throughout your city wherever you want them to be. Okay? Because once...
Here where they're at, sir?
No, I don't care. The idea here is just detail, right? We understand the basics of cinema. We've gone through all those basic processes. Now what we're going to do is start really playing with this to get more of that look. Now I want to show one more thing to have you guys do this before I let you start playing. When we render this, you can see that this already looks pretty boring. And it's hard to see any of the detail that we put into it, okay? Because we're using these special materials, we don't really get a good look for what this is shaping out to be. So go under your render settings, the little gear thing up at the top. And what we want to do is under Effect, we want to add Ambient Occlusion. Occlusion. Yep, OCC. LUSION. Okay. Now what ambient occlusion is going to do for us is if you look at the before and you look at the after, you're going to see we get these things where it's like darkening in some areas. So these are called contact shadows. So if we have two items that are close together like this, in the corner area it will be really dark and then it will kind of feather itself out. So this is, for the most part, how we're going to be doing our shading. And if we get really close to, like, let's say, our window, you can see that it actually looks like there's some lighting or something to it that are giving us that contact shadow, right? And this actually might be just a hair too far away from that window because I see, like, too much of a gap there. So I would go back to my tall building, go back to my cloner, and then make this 22 point, no, not that. 6.5. That's close enough. Okay? So that will help you kind of visualize what your stuff is looking like a little bit better because at the end, that's what our scene is going to look like. If you look at my doorway back here, you can't even really see my door at all. Like it's just gone. But now that I've added that, you can definitely see the door and all that detail that I put into it. Okay, and that's one of the reasons that we're using this ambient occlusion setup. Okay, so I'm going to save my scene, which I haven't done at all, which is horrible for me.
I've actually been saving quite a bit.
There we go. And I'm just going to continue working. Okay, so I'm